In one corner, partially hidden by water heaters and electrical panels, was a section of the original stone foundation, and carved into that stone, barely visible after more than a century, were words that made Sarah's heart race. "Catherine, come home. Margaret, come home. All my daughters come home." The carving was crude, done by someone without proper tools, probably using nothing more than a nail or piece of metal scraped repeatedly against the stone. But the desperate emotion behind the words was unmistakable. Victoria Harrington had carved this message into the foundation of her own home, a shrine to her obsession with replacing her dead daughter and claiming the children she had stolen. As Sarah photographed the carving, she noticed something else. Small objects had been placed in crevices around the carved words, pieces of fabric, buttons, what looked like locks of hair tied with ribbons. Offerings left by a grieving mother who had crossed the line from mourning into madness. The fabric appeared to be from children's clothing, different colors and textures suggesting they had come from multiple sources. But the most disturbing discovery was a small metal frame, tarnished with age but still intact, wedged deep into a crack in the foundation. Inside the frame was a photograph, not of Catherine Harrington, as Sarah had expected, but of Margaret Whitmore. It was one of the images that had been cut from the family portraits found in Victoria's mansion, carefully preserved and hidden in this makeshift shrine. The photograph showed Margaret smiling, but someone had drawn additional lines around her face with what appeared to be ink, creating the illusion of tears streaming down her cheeks. Words had been written in the margin in the same desperate handwriting as the carved message, "My daughter remembers her real mother now." Sarah understood now why Victoria had paid the photographer to hide during the Whitmore family portrait session. It hadn't been enough for her to follow and observe from a distance. She had needed to be present during their most intimate family moment, to insert herself into their happiness and their unity. The studio portrait with Victoria's face watching from the shadows wasn't just evidence of stalking. It was the moment when Victoria had decided to act on her obsessions, to take what she felt was rightfully hers. Sarah carefully collected the artifacts from the basement shrine, knowing they would need to be turned over to the police despite the case's age. But as she handled the photograph of Margaret Whitmore, she felt a strange sensation, as if the image was warm to the touch. The temperature in the basement seemed to drop suddenly, and she could swear she heard the faint sound of a child crying somewhere in the building above. That night, Sarah dreamed again. But this time the dream was different, more vivid and detailed than any she had experienced before. She found herself standing in the photographer's studio in 1909, watching as the Whitmore family posed for their portrait. She could smell the chemical scents of the developing solutions, hear the photographer's instructions to hold still, feel the tension in the air as the family maintained their formal poses. But in the dream, Margaret seemed to sense the hidden presence. The child's head turned slightly, just enough for her eyes to find Victoria's hiding place behind the backdrop. For a moment, the two locked gazes, and Sarah saw recognition and fear flash across Margaret's young face. The child had seen Victoria before, probably during one of her stalking episodes, and she understood instinctively that the woman's presence meant danger. Margaret tried to alert her parents, tugging at her mother's dress and whispering urgently, but Elizabeth Whitmore simply smiled and told her daughter to stand still for the photographer. The adults were focused on the formal requirements of the portrait session, unaware of the drama playing out between their daughter and the hidden observer. Margaret's mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound emerged. Victoria Harrington stepped forward from her hiding place, walking toward the family with a smile that was both tender and terrifying. In the dream, Sarah could see Victoria's face clearly, her eyes bright with anticipation and madness, her hands reaching out toward Margaret with possessive hunger. None of the adults seemed to see Victoria approaching. Only Margaret watched in frozen horror as the woman who had been stalking her family reached out with pale hands that seemed to shimmer in the studio light. Victoria's lips moved as she spoke, but Sarah couldn't make out the words. Margaret shrank back against her mother, tears streaming down her face, but her parents remained oblivious to their daughter's terror. Sarah woke from the dream, with tears on her face, understanding finally what the photographs had been trying to tell her. Margaret Whitmore hadn't just been abducted that day in Central Park. She had been marked from the moment Victoria Harrington first saw her, claimed in that photographer's studio where a grief-stricken woman had hidden in the shadows and chosen her replacement daughter. The next morning, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She returned to the apartment building on Fifth Avenue, asking to speak with some of the long-term tenants about their experiences in the building. Mr. Peterson reluctantly provided her with a list of residents who had lived there for more than 10 years, warning her that some of them might be reluctant to discuss what they considered private matters. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had occupied a fifth-floor apartment for nearly 30 years, invited Sarah in for tea when she learned about the historical research. The apartment was neat and comfortable, filled with family photographs and mementos of a long life. But Sarah noticed that Mrs. Chen kept glancing toward the hallway as if expecting someone to appear. She listened carefully as Sarah explained about the mansion that had previously stood on the site and the tragic events of 1909. When Sarah finished her account, Mrs. Chen sat quietly for a moment before responding. "I'm not surprised by what you're telling me," she said quietly. "There's always been something sad about this building, something that makes you feel like you're not alone even when you should be. My granddaughter used to visit me when she was small, but she refused to stay here after she turned 8 years old. Said there was a little girl in the hallway who tried to talk to her, but the words came out wrong." Mrs. Chen described seeing a child in old-fashioned clothing who appeared in the building's corridors, usually late at night or in the early morning hours. The child never spoke clearly, but seemed to be trying to communicate something important. Other tenants had reported similar sightings over the years, always of the same little girl, always appearing sad and lost. The child would appear in different parts of the building, sometimes standing by the elevators as if waiting for someone, sometimes walking the hallways with slow, deliberate steps. She never approached the living residents directly, but she seemed to be searching for something or someone, her eyes always focused on some distant point that no one else could see. Most disturbing were the accounts of families who had moved out after their own young daughters began exhibiting strange behaviors, children who claimed to have an invisible playmate who was very sad and couldn't find her mama, who would set out extra places at the table or save toys for someone who wasn't there. Parents who woke in the night to find their daughters standing at their bedroom windows as if waiting for someone to arrive. Sarah realized that Margaret Whitmore's story hadn't ended with her disappearance in 1909. The child's spirit had remained connected to the place where Victoria Harrington had brought her, where she had been held captive and possibly killed. For more than a century, Margaret had been trying to find her way home, appearing to other children who might understand her plight. But there was something else Mrs. Chen mentioned that chilled Sarah to the bone. In recent months, the sightings had changed. Instead of appearing alone, the ghostly child was sometimes seen in the company of an adult woman, someone who seemed to be leading or guiding her through the building. The woman was described as middle-aged, wearing clothing that looked old-fashioned even for someone of her apparent age. She never looked at the living tenants who glimpsed her, keeping her attention focused entirely on the child beside her. But there was something possessive about her posture, something that suggested ownership rather than care. The woman would place her hand on the child's shoulder in a gesture that looked protective, but felt somehow wrong to those who witnessed it. The child would walk beside her obediently, but her movements seemed mechanical, as if she were being controlled rather than choosing her own actions. Victoria Harrington's spirit, it seemed, had also remained tied to this place, continuing her obsession with Margaret Whitmore even beyond death. The two were trapped together in an eternal recreation of the tragedy that had destroyed both their lives, with Victoria maintaining her delusion of maternal possession, while Margaret remained forever separated from her real family. Sarah left Mrs. Chen's apartment with a heavy heart, understanding that she had uncovered more than just a historical mystery. She had found evidence of a supernatural tragedy that was still unfolding, more than a century after it began. That evening, she sat in her laboratory staring at the original studio portrait, seeing it now with complete clarity. The family's happiness, Victoria's hidden presence, the moment when obsession had crystallized into action. But most heartbreaking of all was young Margaret's face, innocent and trusting, unaware that her life was about to be stolen by a woman whose grief had curdled into madness. Sarah made copies of all the photographs and documentation, sending them to Detective Santos along with her complete analysis. Even if no legal action could be taken, the truth needed to be preserved, documented, and understood. Future researchers might find ways to help Margaret Whitmore's spirit find the peace that had eluded her for so long. But as Sarah worked late into the night, she began to notice strange things happening in her laboratory. Equipment that she had turned off would mysteriously restart. Files on her computer would open by themselves, always displaying the enhanced image of Victoria Harrington's face from the studio portrait. The temperature in the room would drop suddenly, and she would catch glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision. At first, she dismissed these incidents as the products of stress and overwork. She had been obsessing over the Whitmore case for weeks, working long hours and losing sleep to her increasingly vivid dreams. It was natural that her mind would start playing tricks on her, creating phantom sensations and false perceptions. But the incidents became more frequent and more specific. Sarah would arrive at work to find new files on her computer, files that she had never created. They contained enhanced versions of the Whitmore photographs, processed with techniques and software that she hadn't used. The images showed details that she had never been able to bring out, revealing new aspects of Victoria Harrington's face and posture that made her intentions even clearer. In these mysteriously enhanced images, Victoria's expression showed a level of calculation and predatory intelligence that was deeply unsettling. Her eyes were fixed not just on Margaret Whitmore, but on the entire family, as if she were planning something that extended beyond simple abduction. Her smile had a quality of anticipation that suggested she was looking forward to whatever she had planned. Sarah began to feel as if she were being watched, even when she was alone in the laboratory. She would turn around expecting to see someone behind her, only to find empty space. But the sensation of being observed never went away, and she started to notice that the feeling was strongest when she was working on the Whitmore photographs. It was David who first commented on the changes in Sarah's behavior. She had become distant and preoccupied, often staring at the photographs for hours without speaking. She had stopped eating regular meals and was clearly not sleeping well, evident from the dark circles under her eyes and her increasingly pale complexion. "Sarah, you need to take a break from this case," he said one afternoon, finding her once again absorbed in studying the studio portrait. "You've been working on it non-stop for 3 weeks, and it's affecting your health. Maybe it's time to turn the material over to someone else." "I can't stop now," Sarah replied without looking away from the screen. "I'm so close to understanding what really happened. The photographs are trying to tell me something important, something that everyone else missed for over a century." David looked at the monitor, seeing the same enhanced image of Victoria Harrington that Sarah had been staring at for the past hour. The woman's face seemed to leer out of the photograph with malevolent intent, her eyes bright with an intelligence that transcended the limitations of the century-old image. "Sarah, this is just a photograph," David said gently. "A very old photograph of a disturbed woman who did terrible things more than 100 years ago. It can't tell you anything beyond what's actually captured in the image. You're starting to read meanings into it that aren't really there." But Sarah wasn't convinced. That night, she dreamed again of the Harrington mansion, but this time she wasn't just observing the events of 1909. She was participating in them, standing in Victoria's parlor as the woman showed her the bedroom she had prepared for Margaret Whitmore. The room was decorated like a shrine to Catherine Harrington, but with new additions that were clearly meant for a living child. A bed with fresh linens, toys arranged carefully on shelves, clothing in Margaret's size hanging in the wardrobe. Victoria moved through the room with the pride of a woman showing off her greatest accomplishment. "She's going to be so happy here," Victoria said in the dream, her voice filled with maternal satisfaction. "She'll forget all about that other family, the ones who didn't really appreciate her. I'll be the mother she's always needed, the one who understands how special she is." But as Victoria spoke, Sarah noticed that the room had no windows, and the door had multiple locks on the inside. This wasn't a bedroom prepared for a beloved child. It was a prison designed to hold a captive. In the dream, Sarah tried to warn Victoria that what she was planning was wrong, that Margaret belonged with her real family. But Victoria's expression hardened, and her voice took on a dangerous edge. "You don't understand," she said coldly. "These people don't deserve children. They take them for granted, don't realize how precious they are until it's too late. I'm saving Margaret from a life of neglect and indifference. She'll be much happier as my daughter." Sarah woke from the dream with the terrible understanding that Victoria Harrington had genuinely believed she was rescuing Margaret Whitmore rather than kidnapping her. In her delusional state, Victoria had convinced herself that she was a better mother than Elizabeth Whitmore, that she could provide Margaret with the kind of obsessive love that she had lavished on Catherine. But that obsessive love had already killed one child, and Sarah was beginning to understand that it had claimed Margaret as well. The next day brought a discovery that confirmed Sarah's worst fears. While researching newspaper archives from late 1909, she found an article that had been buried in the back pages of the New York Sun, a small notice about a fire at a Fifth Avenue mansion, the same address that had belonged to Victoria Harrington. The fire had occurred on November 15, 1909, just 2 days before Victoria's final institutionalization. According to the brief report, the fire had been contained to a single room on the second floor, but smoke damage had made much of the house uninhabitable. The fire department had found evidence of someone living in the burned room, but no one had been present when they arrived. Sarah realized that this must have been Margaret's prison, the room that Victoria had prepared so carefully for her captive daughter. Had the child tried to escape by setting a fire? Had she died in the flames, leaving Victoria with nothing but delusions of her continued presence? The timeline made horrible sense. Margaret had disappeared in September, been held captive in Victoria's mansion for 2 months, and then died in the fire in November. Victoria's final breakdown and hospitalization had followed immediately afterward, triggered by the loss of both her replacement daughter and her elaborate fantasy of restored motherhood. But the most disturbing implication was that Victoria's spirit had never accepted Margaret's death, just as she had never accepted Catherine's. Even beyond death, Victoria continued to believe that both children belonged to her, that she had the right to claim them as her daughters, regardless of their own desires or their family's grief. Sarah began to understand why Margaret's spirit had never found peace. She wasn't just lost, she was being held captive by Victoria's ghost, just as she had been held captive in life. Victoria's obsession had transcended death itself, binding the child's spirit to her own, in an eternal recreation of her delusional motherhood. That night, as Sarah worked late in her laboratory, she felt the temperature in the room drop suddenly. The lights flickered and her computer screen began to display images that she hadn't opened, but these weren't the Whitmore photographs she had been studying. They were new images, photographs that seemed to have been taken recently, showing the interior of the apartment building that stood on the site of Victoria's mansion. In these mysterious photographs, Sarah could see 2 figures moving through the building's corridors. One was clearly Margaret Whitmore, appearing exactly as she had in 1909, but with the translucent quality of a ghost. She moved through the hallways with the mechanical obedience of someone under another's control, her face showing no expression beyond profound sadness. Beside her walked Victoria Harrington, solid and substantial, in a way that Margaret was not. Victoria's face showed the same possessive satisfaction that Sarah had seen in the original studio portrait, the expression of a woman who believed she had finally achieved her heart's desire. She kept one hand on Margaret's shoulder at all times, a gesture that looked protective but was clearly imprisoning. As Sarah watched the images appear on her screen, she realized that someone was documenting the ongoing supernatural tragedy. These photographs were being taken in real time, showing Victoria and Margaret as they continued their eternal captivity in the building that stood where their tragedy had begun. But who was taking these photographs, and why were they being shown to Sarah? The answer came in the form of a reflection visible in one of the images. In the glass of the building's entrance doors, Sarah could see the photographer. It was herself, standing in the lobby with a camera, documenting the ghostly figures as they moved through their endless routine of captivity and control. But Sarah was in her laboratory, not in the apartment building. She had never taken these photographs, never even visited the building at night. Yet there she was in the reflection, part of the supernatural drama that had been unfolding for more than a century. Sarah understood now that Victoria Harrington had found a new subject for her obsession, a new person to study and follow and claim. Just as she had once stalked the Whitmore family, learning their routines and positioning herself to observe their private moments, Victoria was now focused on Sarah, studying her life and planning her next move. The photographs on her computer screen changed, showing Sarah's own apartment, taken from outside her windows. In image after image, Victoria could be seen standing in Sarah's garden, watching her house with the same intense focus she had once directed toward the Whitmore family. Margaret stood beside her, a ghostly child trapped in an eternal nightmare of false motherhood. Sarah realized that her investigation into the Whitmore case had marked her as Victoria's next target. By studying the photographs so intensively, by uncovering the truth about Victoria's crimes, Sarah had attracted the attention of a spirit that had been hunting for more than a century. But unlike Margaret Whitmore, Sarah understood what was happening to her. She recognized the signs of supernatural stalking and realized that she had become part of a pattern that had begun in 1909. Victoria's obsession had found a new focus, and she was already planning to claim Sarah just as she had claimed Margaret more than a century ago. The question now was whether Sarah could break the cycle, whether she could find a way to free Margaret's spirit and stop Victoria from claiming another victim. The photographs had revealed the truth about the past, but they had also drawn Sarah into a supernatural trap that had been waiting for someone exactly like her. As Sarah sat in her laboratory, surrounded by the evidence of Victoria Harrington's century-long obsession, she could feel the ghost's attention focused on her like a physical weight. Somewhere in the building that stood on the site of the Harrington mansion, Victoria was planning her next move, preparing to add Sarah to her collection of daughters who would never be allowed to leave. The studio portrait from 1909 flickered on her screen one final time, but now Sarah could see her own face reflected in the glass of the computer monitor, superimposed over the image of the Whitmore family. She had become part of the photograph, part of the story, part of Victoria Harrington's eternal hunt for the perfect daughter. And in the shadows of the reflection, barely visible but undeniably present, Margaret Whitmore's ghostly figure raised one translucent hand in what might have been a warning, or perhaps a plea for help from someone who understood the truth about her century-long captivity. Sarah realized that some photographs capture more than just moments in time. They can preserve obsessions, trap souls, and bridge the gap between past and present in ways that science cannot explain. The Whitmore family portrait would remain in the archives, a window into a tragedy that refused to stay buried. But it had also become a doorway through which the past could reach into the present and claim new victims. As the laboratory lights flickered one final time and went out, leaving Sarah alone in the darkness with only the glow of her computer screen, she understood that she was no longer just studying history. She had become part of it, another chapter in Victoria Harrington's endless story of obsession, possession, and the terrible price of a mother's love that refused to acknowledge the boundaries between life and death. The sterile white corridors of Columbia University's Digital Forensics Laboratory, Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her monitor as she examined what appeared to be just another routine photograph restoration project. The year was 2024, and as head of the university's Historical Image Analysis Department, Sarah had processed thousands of century-old photographs, each one a window into America's past. But this particular image, submitted by the New York Historical Society as part of their ongoing digitization project, would prove to be unlike anything she had ever encountered. The photograph had arrived that morning with minimal documentation. A simple note attached read, "Family portrait circa 1909 Manhattan. Donated by the estate of Margaret Whitmore, no surviving relatives." The image itself appeared unremarkable at first glance. A well-dressed family of four posed formally in what looked like a photographer's studio. The father, a distinguished man in his 40s, wearing a dark suit and pocket watch chain, stood behind his seated wife. She was elegantly dressed in a high-necked white blouse with intricate lace details, her hair arranged in the Gibson girl style popular during the Edwardian era. Their two children, a boy of perhaps 12 and a girl around 8, stood beside their parents, both impeccably dressed and maintaining the serious expressions typical of formal portraits from that time. Nothing unusual about the composition, the lighting, or the subjects themselves. Yet something about the image had caught Sarah's attention immediately. Perhaps it was her years of experience analyzing historical photographs, or maybe just an intuitive sense that something was amiss, but she found herself unable to look away from the family's faces. There was a tension there, subtle but unmistakable to someone trained to read the emotions hidden beneath the composed facades of the past. The father's hand, resting on his wife's shoulder, seemed to grip with more force than was necessary for the pose. The mother's smile, while perfectly appropriate for a formal portrait, didn't quite reach her eyes. There was a tightness around her mouth, a barely perceptible strain that suggested she was working to maintain her composure. The children, too, seemed unusually stiff, even for an era when long exposure times required subjects to hold perfectly still for extended periods. Sarah began her standard examination protocol, scanning the image at high resolution and running it through various digital enhancement processes. The photograph was of excellent quality for its age, suggesting it had been taken by a skilled professional photographer with high-end equipment. The lighting was carefully arranged, the composition expertly balanced, and the focus sharp throughout the frame. As the pixels became clearer and the details more defined, she noticed what appeared to be a slight blur in the background of the photograph, behind the family. Studio portraits from this era typically featured plain backdrops or simple painted scenes, but this one seemed to have an inconsistency in the pattern. There was what looked like a fold or wrinkle in the backdrop that created an odd shadow. But as Sarah examined it more closely, she realized it wasn't a flaw in the fabric at all. It was movement, captured during the exposure, creating a ghostly impression of something that shouldn't have been there. She zoomed in on the area, applying noise reduction filters and sharpening algorithms. What emerged from the digital enhancement made her pause. There, partially obscured by the shadows and the grain of the century-old photograph, was what appeared to be another figure, not clearly defined, not obviously human at first glance, but definitely present. Her face pale and indistinct, seeming to peer around the edge of what might have been a piece of studio equipment or a backdrop support. The more Sarah enhanced the image, the clearer the figure became. It was definitely a person, a woman, by the appearance of the clothing and hairstyle. She was positioned behind and to the left of the family, partially hidden but deliberately placed so that she could observe the portrait session without being included in the main composition. Her dress appeared to be of the same era as the family's clothing, dark-colored and formal, but there was something about her posture that suggested she was not supposed to be there. Sarah leaned back in her chair, considering the possibilities. Photography in 1909 was still a cumbersome process, requiring long exposure times and careful staging. Professional photographers of that era were meticulous about controlling every element within their frame. The presence of an unauthorized person in the studio during a formal portrait session would have been highly unusual, potentially ruinous to the photographer's reputation if discovered by clients who expected privacy and exclusivity during their sessions. It wasn't uncommon for accidental double exposures to occur, or for assistants or other people in the studio to appear as ghostly figures if they moved during the exposure. Yet this face seemed too deliberate, too positioned to be an accident. The woman appeared to be crouching or kneeling, maintaining a low profile to avoid detection by the family, while still being able to observe them clearly. Her face was turned toward the subjects, not the camera, suggesting that her interest was in the family themselves rather than the photographic process. Her research assistant, David Martinez, knocked on her office door before entering with his usual morning coffee offering. "Sarah, you've been staring at that screen for 2 hours. Find something interesting." David was a graduate student in art history, specializing in early American photography. His keen eye for detail and extensive knowledge of photographic techniques from different eras had proven invaluable in previous projects. He had worked with Sarah for 3 years, helping to authenticate and analyze hundreds of historical images. Sarah gestured to her monitor. "Take a look at this. Tell me what you see." David approached, studying the enhanced image over her shoulder. He had developed a systematic approach to examining historical photographs, looking first at the technical aspects, then the composition, and finally the subjects themselves. "Standard family portrait, early 1900s, he said after a moment of examination. "Nice quality for the period. The photographer knew what he was doing. Professional lighting setup, good depth of field, sharp focus throughout. The family appears to be upper class, judging by their clothing and the formal studio setting. Probably cost them a significant sum to have this portrait taken." "Look closer," Sarah prompted, pointing to the background area she had been analyzing. "Behind the family. Focus on the shadows near the left edge of the backdrop." David squinted at the screen, then leaned in closer as his expression changed. "Is that another person back there? It looks like there's someone hiding behind the backdrop." That's highly unusual for a professional portrait of this caliber. Studio photographers were extremely careful about controlling their environment. "That's what I thought too," Sarah confirmed. "But look at the positioning. Whoever it is, they're not accidentally caught in the shot. They're deliberately positioned to be partially visible, almost like they're watching the family. The angle suggests they're crouching down to stay hidden from the subjects while maintaining a clear line of sight to observe them." The two researchers spent the next hour applying various digital techniques to clarify the mysterious figure. Edge enhancement revealed the outline of a woman's dress and the curve of her shoulder. Contrast adjustment brought out the details of her hair, which appeared to be dark and pulled back in a severe style typical of the period. Pixel interpolation helped define her facial features, though they remained frustratingly indistinct due to the limitations of the original photograph and her position in shadow. With each process, more details emerged. The face appeared to be that of a woman, middle-aged with sharp features and deep-set eyes. Her expression was difficult to read due to the image quality and the angle, but there was something intense about her gaze, something that seemed to focus not on the camera, but on the family themselves. Her mouth appeared to be slightly open, as if she were breathing heavily or perhaps even speaking, though no sound could cross the century-old divide between the photograph and the present. More troubling was the fact that none of the family members seemed aware of her presence. Their positioning, their expressions, everything suggested they believed they were alone in the studio with the photographer. The father's protective stance behind his wife, the mother's attempt to appear composed and dignified, the children's careful attention to maintaining proper posture, all indicated a family focused entirely on the formal requirements of the portrait session. Yet this woman watched them from the shadows, close enough to reach out and touch them if she chose to reveal herself. There was something predatory about her positioning, something that suggested she was studying them rather than merely observing a photographic session. "I need to find out more about this photograph," Sarah decided. "The documentation is minimal, but maybe the Historical Society has additional information about the family or the circumstances surrounding this portrait. There might be records about the photographer, the studio, or even the specific session when this was taken." David nodded in agreement. "I can start researching photography studios in Manhattan from 1909. If we can identify where this was taken, we might learn more about their practices, whether they typically allowed observers during sittings, what their policies were regarding privacy and access to their studios. Professional photographers of this era typically maintained detailed records of their clients and sessions. They had to, given the expense and complexity of the photographic process. Appointment books, client lists, payment records, even notes about specific requests or unusual circumstances might still exist in archives somewhere. Sarah contacted the New York Historical Society that afternoon, speaking with Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the curator who had submitted the photograph. Unfortunately, Margaret Whitmore's estate had provided very little context when they donated the collection. The woman had died at age 93 with no living relatives, and her personal papers had been sparse. She had lived alone for the final decades of her life, maintaining only minimal contact with neighbors and local services. However, Dr. Harper mentioned that there had been other photographs in the donation, mostly of the same family at various stages of their lives. The collection spanned what appeared to be several years, documenting family gatherings, outings, and formal occasions. Margaret had apparently been quite thorough in preserving her family's photographic history. "Could you send me digital copies of those other photographs?" Sarah requested. "They might provide additional context for what I'm seeing in the studio portrait. If this mysterious woman appears in other images, it could help us understand who she was and what her relationship to the family might have been." Within hours, she received a collection of 23 images spanning what appeared to be a period from approximately 1907 to 1911. There were casual family scenes in parks, formal portraits taken at different times and locations, and what looked like vacation photographs from various locations around New York and beyond. The family appeared prosperous and happy in these images, documenting the kind of comfortable upper-class life that was typical of successful Manhattan families during the early 20th century. As Sarah examined each image methodically, a pattern began to emerge that made her blood run cold. In every single photograph, somewhere in the background or at the edges of the frame, was the same woman. Sometimes she was more clearly visible, sometimes just a partial figure or a face in a crowd, but always there, always watching the family with that same intense, unwavering focus. In a photograph taken at what appeared to be a carnival or fair, the woman stood behind a game booth, her eyes fixed on the family as they enjoyed the festivities. She was positioned about 30 feet away, far enough to avoid immediate notice, but close enough to observe their every move. The family appeared to be having a wonderful time, the children laughing at a puppet show, while their parents watched with indulgent smiles, completely unaware of the figure studying them from across the midway. In another image, taken in what looked like Central Park, she could be seen sitting on a bench in the distance, partially obscured by trees, but unmistakably the same person. The family was having a picnic on the grass, spread out on a large blanket with an elaborate meal laid out before them. The woman on the bench was too distant to be clearly defined, but her posture was rigid, alert, focused entirely on the family group, even as other park visitors walked past her without acknowledgement. A beach photograph showed her as a figure walking along the shoreline far behind the family, too distant to be clearly defined, but recognizable by her distinctive dress and the way she moved. The family was building sandcastles near the water's edge, the children squealing with delight as waves washed over their feet. The woman paced back and forth in the background, never approaching but never losing sight of her subjects. Perhaps most disturbing was an image taken inside what appeared to be a church during a service. The family sat in a pew near the front, dressed in their Sunday finest, following along in their hymnals with apparent devotion. But in the back of the church, barely visible among the shadows of the rear pews, the woman could be seen standing against the wall, her attention focused not on the altar or the service, but on the back of the family's heads as they worshipped. David, who had been cataloguing the images and cross-referencing them with known locations and dates, looked up from his computer with a troubled expression. "Sarah, I've been through all 23 photographs, and she's in every single one. That's not coincidence, that's systematic stalking. But the really disturbing part is that the family never seems to notice her. In all these images they appear happy, relaxed, completely unaware that they're being followed and observed. The consistency of her presence suggested a level of organization and planning that was deeply unsettling. This wasn't random encounters or coincidental appearances at public events. The woman had to have been tracking the family's movements, learning their routines, anticipating their activities well enough to position herself for observation at each location. Sarah pulled up the original studio portrait again, staring at the hidden woman's face with new understanding. Who was she? Why was she following this family with such dedication and intensity? And why had someone felt compelled to document her presence in what should have been private family moments? The implications were deeply disturbing. If the woman had been systematically stalking the family, gaining access to their private activities, and even their formal portrait session, what had been her ultimate goal? What did she want from them, and how far had she been willing to go to get it? The next morning brought a breakthrough in their research. David had managed to identify the photography studio based on distinctive equipment visible in the background of the portrait. A particular style of adjustable light reflector and a unique backdrop support system had been signature features of Hartwell & Sons Photography Studio, which had operated on Fifth Avenue from 1895 to 1915, catering to Manhattan's wealthy families. The studio had built its reputation on discretion and quality, serving clients who expected both technical excellence and absolute privacy during their sessions. Their business records, preserved in the New York City archives as part of a collection documenting the city's commercial history, included detailed appointment books, client lists, and even notes about special requests or unusual circumstances. According to the appointment book from March 1909, the family portrait had been scheduled for the Whitmore family. Jonathan Whitmore, age 42, listed as a banker with offices in the financial district. His wife Elizabeth, age 38, described in the studio's notes as very particular about lighting and composition. Their children were listed as Thomas, age 12, and young Margaret, age 8. The same Margaret who had lived to be 93 and whose estate had donated the photographs to the Historical Society. But there was something else in the studio's records that caught David's attention. A notation in the margin next to the Whitmore appointment, written in different ink and apparently added after the original booking. Mrs. Harrington insisted on observing. Payment received for discretion. This was followed by what appeared to be the photographer's initials and a substantial sum of money, enough to cover the cost of several portrait sessions. Who was Mrs. Harrington, and why had she paid to observe the Whitmore family's portrait session? Sarah immediately began searching through city records, census data, and newspaper archives from 1909, looking for any mention of a woman by that name who might have had some connection to the Whitmore family. What she discovered painted a disturbing picture of obsession and tragedy that reached back to the darkest corners of New York's social elite. Victoria Harrington had been a member of Manhattan's upper class, married to Charles Harrington, a prominent textile manufacturer whose business interests spanned from New York to New England. The Harringtons had lived in a grand mansion on Fifth Avenue, just a few blocks from where the Whitmore family resided. In 1908, their only child, a daughter named Catherine, had died in a tragic accident at age 7. According to newspaper accounts of the time, the child had fallen from a third-story window in the family's Fifth Avenue mansion while playing with her governess. The governess had been momentarily distracted by a visitor at the front door, and Catherine had climbed onto a window seat to look down at the street below. The window, which should have been securely latched, had given way under the child's weight, sending her plummeting to the stone courtyard below. Victoria had suffered a complete mental breakdown following the loss. Hospital records indicated that she had been institutionalized twice for what doctors of the era termed melancholia with delusional features, but had been released both times into her husband's care due to his influence and wealth. The treatments available for mental illness in 1909 were primitive and often ineffective, relying heavily on rest cures and isolation rather than any real understanding of psychological trauma. But it was the pattern Sarah discovered in Victoria's behavior after her release from the hospital that truly chilled her. Police reports and newspaper articles from 1908 and 1909 documented a series of incidents involving Victoria and other families with young children. She had been found loitering near schools, following families in public parks, and attempting to approach children who bore some resemblance to her deceased daughter. Hospital records indicated that Victoria had become obsessed with other families, particularly those with young daughters who resembled her deceased child. She had developed elaborate fantasies about replacing Catherine with another girl, often speaking to doctors and nurses about children she had adopted or rescued from inadequate parents. The medical staff had documented her delusions with clinical detachment, noting her inability to accept her daughter's death and her increasing disconnection from reality. The pattern Sarah was seeing in the photographs suddenly made terrible sense. Victoria Harrington wasn't just randomly appearing in the background of the Whitmore family pictures. She was stalking them, fixated on young Margaret Whitmore, who bore a striking resemblance to her dead daughter Catherine. The similarity was remarkable when Sarah compared photographs of the two children. Both had dark hair worn in ringlets, both had large, expressive eyes, and both possessed the kind of delicate beauty that was prized in upper-class children of the era. But how had Victoria managed to be present at so many private family moments? How had she known where the Whitmores would be, when they would be there? And more disturbing, how had she convinced the photographer to let her hide in his studio during their formal portrait session? Sarah continued her research into Victoria Harrington's background, uncovering a web of connections that explained her access to the Whitmore family's activities. Through her husband's business dealings, Victoria had social connections that gave her insight into the movements of other prominent families. She attended the same charity functions, belonged to the same clubs, moved in the same circles that included the Whitmores. It would have been relatively easy for her to learn about the family's plans and position herself to observe them. The payment to the photographer suggested that she had been systematically bribing service providers to allow her access. A studio assistant here, a park groundskeeper there, perhaps even servants in the Whitmore household who could provide information about the family's schedule and activities. Victoria's wealth would have made such arrangements possible, and her social status would have provided her with the connections necessary to identify and approach potential collaborators. But there was something else that Sarah discovered in the archives, something that elevated Victoria's stalking from disturbing to potentially criminal. A series of reports filed with the New York Police Department documented complaints from several Manhattan families about a woman who had been following their children, attempting to approach them in public places, and even trying to gain entry to their homes under various pretenses. The descriptions in these reports all matched Victoria Harrington's appearance and behavior. A well-dressed woman in her 30s, elegantly spoken and claiming to be a family friend or distant relative, attempting to gain access to children between the ages of 6 and 10. Parents had reported finding her in their gardens, watching their homes from across the street, and following their children to and from school. David had been researching the fate of the Whitmore family, and what he discovered added another layer of tragedy to the story. In September 1909, just 6 months after the studio portrait was taken, young Margaret Whitmore had disappeared while playing in Central Park with her governess. The child had been there one moment, gone the next, with no witnesses to her disappearance despite the public nature of the location. The subsequent police investigation had been extensive, but fruitless. There were no signs of struggle, no ransom demands, no credible witness accounts of anyone approaching the child or leading her away. Margaret Whitmore had simply vanished, leaving behind a devastated family and a mystery that remained unsolved. The case had made headlines in the New York newspapers for weeks, with public sympathy and private investigators hired by the family proving equally ineffective in locating the missing child. Sarah stared at the studio portrait, at the hidden face of Victoria Harrington, watching the family with those intense, calculating eyes. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. The woman who had been stalking the Whitmore family, obsessed with their young daughter who resembled her own lost child, and 6 months later that same child had disappeared without a trace. But there was something else Sarah had noticed in her examination of the photographs, something that had been bothering her without her quite realizing why. In the images where Victoria Harrington was visible, particularly those taken after the studio portrait in March, there seemed to be another figure, even more indistinct than the stalking woman. A smaller figure, always near Victoria, sometimes just a shadow, sometimes a glimpse of clothing or hair. Sarah applied her most advanced enhancement techniques to these secondary figures. What emerged from the digital processing was chilling. In image after image, there appeared to be a child with Victoria Harrington, not clearly defined, always partially obscured but consistently present. A little girl in old-fashioned clothing, holding what looked like Victoria's hand, or walking beside her with the posture of someone being led rather than choosing their own direction. The implications were horrifying. Had Victoria Harrington abducted Margaret Whitmore? Was the child in these photographs the missing girl, being held captive by a woman whose grief had twisted into something monstrous? The timeline fit perfectly. The later photographs in the collection, those taken after September 1909, all showed Victoria with this mysterious child figure, suggesting that she had indeed taken Margaret and was keeping her as a replacement for her deceased daughter. But there were details about the child figure that deeply disturbed Sarah as she examined them more closely. The clothing appeared wrong for the time period, more reminiscent of the 1890s than 1909, heavy and old-fashioned even by the standards of the era. The child's posture suggested fear or resignation rather than the natural movement of a happy child. In the clearest images, the little girl's face appeared pale and drawn, with an expression of profound sadness that seemed far beyond her years. Sarah immediately contacted the NYPD's Cold Case Division, though she knew that a crime from 1909 was far beyond any statute of limitations. Detective Maria Santos, who specialized in historical cases and had worked with academic researchers before, agreed to meet with Sarah to examine the evidence. The photographs tell a story. Detective Santos agreed after reviewing Sarah's analysis. This woman was clearly stalking the family, and the timing of the child's disappearance is highly suspicious. But proving what happened over a century later, when all the principals are dead and most of the evidence has been lost to time, that's going to be impossible from a legal standpoint. Still, Detective Santos was intrigued enough to authorize a search of historical records that might shed more light on Victoria Harrington's activities following Margaret's disappearance. What they discovered in the archives of Bellevue Hospital's psychiatric ward was both enlightening and deeply disturbing. Victoria Harrington had been readmitted to the hospital in October 1909, just 1 month after Margaret's disappearance. The admitting physician's notes described a woman in a complete delusional state, claiming that her daughter had come home and was living with her in her Fifth Avenue mansion. She spoke constantly to someone who wasn't there, prepared meals for 2 people, and became violent when staff tried to convince her that she was alone. The hospital records painted a picture of a woman completely detached from reality. Victoria insisted that Catherine had never died, that the whole tragedy had been a terrible mistake, and that her daughter was now safely home where she belonged. She described elaborate conversations with the child, shopping trips to buy her new clothes, and bedtime stories read from favorite books. When doctors pointed out that she was alone in her hospital room, Victoria would become agitated and accusatory, claiming that they were trying to steal her daughter away from her again. More tellingly, when Victoria's Fifth Avenue mansion was searched as part of her hospitalization process, authorities found a child's bedroom that had been meticulously maintained. Not just Catherine Harrington's original room, preserved exactly as it had been at the time of her death, but a second bedroom, freshly furnished with toys and clothing appropriate for an 8-year-old girl. Clothing that, according to the police report, matched the descriptions of what Margaret Whitmore had been wearing when she disappeared. The room also contained dozens of photographs of the Whitmore family, carefully mounted and displayed like a shrine. But in these photographs, someone had carefully cut out the image of Margaret Whitmore from each family portrait, leaving behind only the silhouettes of her parents and brother. The missing pieces had been arranged in a separate display, creating a gallery of images showing only the little girl, removed from her family context, and presented as if she were a Harrington rather than a Whitmore. Where were those cut-out images now? What had Victoria done with them? The police report noted that they had been confiscated as evidence, but the trail went cold there, the materials presumably lost or destroyed in the intervening decades. Hospital records indicated that Victoria had remained in the psychiatric ward until her death in 1912, never recovering from her delusions about her daughter's return. She died clutching a small photograph that nurses described as showing a young girl, though the identity of the child was never established. The image had been too damaged by Victoria's constant handling to be clearly identifiable, but she had refused to be separated from it even during her final illness. After Victoria's death, her husband Charles had quickly sold the Fifth Avenue mansion and left New York, apparently unable to cope with the scandal and tragedy that had consumed his family. He had relocated to California, where he started a new business and eventually remarried, but he never spoke publicly about his first wife or the circumstances of her death. The mansion had passed through several owners over the decades, eventually being demolished in the 1950s to make way for a modern apartment building. Any physical evidence of Victoria's crimes, if crimes they were, had been destroyed, along with the building that had housed them. But Sarah wasn't finished with her investigation. She had noticed something else in the hospital records that caught her attention. During Victoria's final hospitalization, she had repeatedly spoken about Catherine's sister, a mysterious figure who she claimed visited them at night. The medical staff had dismissed this as another manifestation of her delusions, but Victoria had been very specific about this supposed visitor. According to the nursing notes, Victoria described a little girl who came to their house after dark, someone who looked exactly like Catherine, but was somehow different. She claimed that this other child was lonely and wanted to play with Catherine, but that she was afraid of her because she was cold and wouldn't talk. Victoria had become increasingly agitated about these nighttime visits, begging the hospital staff to make sure that Catherine was safe from her mysterious sister. Sarah began to wonder if Victoria's delusions might have contained some grain of truth. Had Margaret Whitmore died while in Victoria's custody? Had the woman's grief-stricken mind created an elaborate fantasy in which both children, the dead Catherine and the missing Margaret, continued to exist in some form? The photographs seemed to support this horrifying possibility. In the later images of the collection, those taken shortly before Victoria's final hospitalization, the child figure near Victoria appeared increasingly transparent, increasingly ghost-like, not in the way that accidental double exposures created ghostly images, but as if the child was fading away, becoming less substantial with each photograph. Sarah found herself obsessing over the case, spending long hours enhancing and re-examining every photograph in the collection. She began to notice details that she had initially missed, subtle changes in the child figure's appearance that suggested a progression over time. In the earliest images taken shortly after Margaret's disappearance, the child appeared solid and present, though clearly distressed. In later photographs, she became increasingly indistinct, as if she were literally disappearing from the world. David had been researching missing children cases from 1909 New York, looking for any pattern that might connect to Victoria Harrington's activities. What he found painted an even darker picture of the woman's descent into madness and the potential scope of her crimes. In the 18 months following her own daughter's death, there had been 7 reported disappearances of young girls in Manhattan, all between the ages of 6 and 9, all bearing some physical resemblance to Catherine Harrington, all vanishing under circumstances that left no clear trail for investigators to follow. The police of 1909 hadn't connected these cases, lacking the communication systems and investigative techniques that might have revealed the pattern. Each disappearance had been investigated separately, with no coordination between different precincts or jurisdictions. Without modern forensic science or psychological profiling, the connection to Victoria Harrington had never been established. But Sarah could see the pattern clearly now, mapped out across the months following Catherine's death, like a trail of breadcrumbs leading to a terrible conclusion. Victoria hadn't just been stalking the Whitmore family. She had been hunting, searching systematically for a replacement for her dead daughter, studying families and selecting targets based on their resemblance to Catherine. The other missing children had likely been practice runs, attempts to fill the void left by her daughter's death that had failed for various reasons. But Margaret Whitmore had been different. The resemblance to Catherine had been stronger, the family situation more similar to Victoria's own lost happiness. Margaret had been the perfect candidate for Victoria's delusional fantasy of maternal restoration. The most chilling discovery came when David found a newspaper article from November 1909, buried in the back pages of the New York Herald. The body of a young girl, estimated to be between 7 and 10 years old, had been found in the East River. The child had been in the water too long for identification, but she was wearing expensive clothing that didn't match any of the reported missing children from the city's poor neighborhoods. The article mentioned that the child appeared to have been dressed in old-fashioned clothing, more appropriate to the 1890s than 1909, leading investigators to theorize that she might have been kept somewhere for an extended period before ending up in the river. The clothing matched the description of the garments found in the mysterious child's bedroom in Victoria's mansion, heavy and outdated even for the time. Sarah stared at this article for a long time, understanding its probable connection to Victoria Harrington's story. The timeline fit perfectly. Victoria had been institutionalized in October 1909, 1 month after Margaret's disappearance and 1 month before the unidentified body was found in the East River. If Victoria had indeed abducted Margaret, the child would have been left alone in Victoria's mansion when the woman was taken to the hospital. A frightened 8-year-old girl, held captive for weeks in a stranger's house, dressed up like a dead child to fulfill a mad woman's delusions. When Victoria didn't return, what had happened to Margaret? Had she tried to escape? Had she wandered into the city only to meet a tragic end in the river? The photographs suggested another possibility, one that Sarah almost didn't want to consider. In the final images of the collection, those that appeared to have been taken shortly before Victoria's institutionalization, the child figure near Victoria appeared increasingly transparent, increasingly ghost-like. Not in the way that accidental double exposures created ghostly images, but as if the child was fading away, becoming less substantial with each photograph. What if Margaret Whitmore had died in Victoria Harrington's mansion? What if the woman's delusions had been so powerful, her grief so consuming, that she had somehow bound the spirit of the dead child to herself? The photographs seemed to document not just stalking and abduction, but something far more supernatural and terrifying. In the clearest image of the child figure, enhanced to the limits of the technology available to Sarah's laboratory, she could make out details of the little girl's face. The resemblance to Margaret Whitmore was unmistakable, but the expression was one of profound sadness and fear. The child's mouth appeared to be open, as if she was trying to speak or scream, but no sound could cross the barrier between the photograph and the present. Sarah had always been a scientist, someone who relied on evidence and logical explanations for phenomena. But the more she studied these images, the more she began to consider possibilities that science couldn't easily explain. The pattern of Victoria's behavior, the mysterious appearances and disappearances in the photographs, the way the child figure seemed to fade over time, it all pointed to something beyond the realm of normal criminal activity. David, reviewing Sarah's latest enhancements, shook his head in disbelief. If this is really Margaret Whitmore in these photographs, if she was held by Victoria Harrington after her disappearance, then we're looking at evidence of one of the most disturbing crimes in New York history. A crime that was never solved because no one realized the photographs existed and no one understood what they were documenting. But Sarah was beginning to think they were looking at something even more disturbing than historical crime. She had been having dreams about the photographs, dreams where she found herself standing in Victoria Harrington's mansion, watching as the delusional woman dressed a terrified little girl in the clothing of her dead daughter. In these dreams, Margaret Whitmore would look directly at Sarah, her eyes pleading for help that could never come. The child would mouth words that Sarah couldn't hear, reaching out with hands that could never quite bridge the gap between past and present. And always, Victoria would be there, smiling with the terrible satisfaction of a woman who believed she had finally reclaimed her lost happiness. The dreams were becoming more frequent and more vivid, as if Sarah's intensive study of the photographs was creating some kind of connection to the events they documented. She would wake in the middle of the night with the taste of old dust in her mouth and the sound of a child's crying echoing in her ears. Sarah began researching the location of Victoria Harrington's former mansion, using city planning records and historical maps to pinpoint exactly where it had stood. The address led her to a modern apartment building on Fifth Avenue, built in 1952, on the site where the mansion had once loomed over the street like a monument to wealth and privilege. She contacted the building's management company, explaining that she was conducting historical research on the property's previous structures. The manager, Mr. Peterson, was surprisingly forthcoming about the building's history, mentioning that they had dealt with unusual incidents over the years that might be connected to the site's past. "We've had some strange occurrences since the building opened," he admitted during their phone conversation. "Tenants reporting unusual sounds, children crying at night, that sort of thing. Nothing that would hold up in court, you understand, but enough to make people uncomfortable. We've had a higher turnover rate than other buildings in the area, particularly among families with young children." He agreed to let Sarah examine the building's basement, where remnants of the original mansion's foundation were still visible. As she descended into the dimly lit space, Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. The basement was largely unremarkable, filled with the mechanical systems necessary for a modern apartment building, but there was something about the atmosphere that made her skin crawl. In